Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of A Voluntary View. Today we've got a special guest, Mr. Ace Archist. That's how you say that, right?
Yes, you got it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Ace is one of Twitter followers, a big fan of his, actually. He tweets out a lot of excellent stuff about liberty. And that, in fact, got him into a little bit of a spat with some, well, you know how it is in Twitter. There's always some kind of spat going on.
Boys.
But yeah, got him into a little bit of a spat over Friday, Saturday. And I don't know, why don't you tell us about that, Ace?
Yeah, I don't even remember what the original tweet that started it, but it was something to do with the Civil War. It was something to do like it spiraled into a conversation of slavery and whether the Union was justified versus the Confederacy, which obviously,
Hmm.
as an anarchist myself, I disagree with both of those. Yeah, that's
Yes.
kind of like the genesis of it, really.
And I actually took a picture of it. The person said, wishing everyone a happy Confederate Surrender Day.
That's what it was.
and
Yes.
and he had this meme picture of a Union soldier drinking a giant bottle of water labeled "Rebel Tears,"
Right.
and that's kind of tasteless, but whatever.
Yeah,
But
it's a
it
meme. But
was
yeah.
superimposed over a picture of Atlanta burning,
Yes.
and that I think for you and me that one was just a little bit too far
Yeah,
because
I mean it's just like, that's Sherman's March is like an atrocity, right? It's just like if you just go back and like read the history of it, it's like what the Union soldiers like did to just the civilians in those towns is just horrific.
Mhm,
It would be
mhm.
like considered a obvious war crime if it happened to, America.
Yeah. But then we now at voluntarism in action, we have a saying that good ideas don't require force.
Hmm.
And the biggest pushback we get from uh, the people who believe just the standard narrative of history is, well, it took force to stop the Nazis, and well, it took force to end slavery, and that's the typical pushback that we get. And I got the impression that that was kind of what you were up against on Friday, Saturday, with this everyone celebrating not only the surrender of the Confederacy, but what it took, what they believe it took to get that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's most people will look at history and they'll look at all like the stacks of bodies. No, they won't even look at the stacks of bodies. They're just numbers to these people, and all that matters is like the goal, right? So like everyone alive agrees that yeah, slavery ending is a great thing. Like I don't think there's any person who would ever disagree with that. But the problem is, what most people don't see is the thousands and thousands and thousands of bodies that are stacked up because of that war. So just because that it might have led to a good consequence, it doesn't mean that everything else that led up to that point was therefore justified. And I think that's the mistake most people make.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. I would agree. So then thinking about more practical considerations.
Hmm.
So you and I would believe did not have to have a war that. Well, let's go back. Is the person they followed up trying to justify their tweet, and they said a few of you are struggling with the fact that the defeat of the breakaway slaver nation is cause for celebration. The Civil War was caused by the CSA seceding over slavery. Any other cause you bring up was secondary. Well, I would say they're conflating the issue there. They say the Civil War was caused by the secession. And I don't think that's true. I agree
Right.
that the secession, in part, yes, they definitely seceded over slavery,
Yes.
among other issues, tariffs, states' rights, etc. So the
Absolutely.
secession, I
Yeah.
believe, was definitely over slavery. But
Yes.
I don't think that that had necessarily to lead to a war.
No,
Your
and it wasn't
thoughts?
even the justification for like the Union going to war. Like, sure, there were some abolitionists who did want war, but a lot of them did not, right? But I mean, if we can just go to like Lincoln himself, Lincoln's main like role in entering the war was to reform the Union. His entire plan was just to keep the Union together at any cost. In fact, if people want to go with this narrative that well, it was just it was to stop slavery, there were northern Union states on the border between the North and South that were allowed to have slaves in the North, right, legally speaking.
Mhm.
So this is just like an ad hoc retroactive narrative that is created. If you go back to like Lincoln's inaugural address or even some of the letters he wrote, he's quite clear that he just wanted the Union back, whether that meant ending slavery or keeping slavery. So it's just a way for him. He felt the Union had to be together no matter what. So yeah, the Confederacy did, like in their charter, in their Constitution, they did advocate. They did say, yeah, we're seceding for slavery, and a list of other reasons, but primarily slavery. But that wasn't the reason the North necessarily went to war with them. That was essentially, slavery was essentially a secondary concern for most of them, if at all.
Yeah, especially when you consider things like the Fugitive Slave Act.
That's right.
I
Yes.
believe that was still in place.
It was.
It hadn't been rescinded at that time.
That's
so,
right.
For those of you who don't know, that was an act by the federal government that said that slaves that escaped slavery in the South legally had to be sent back by northern states that discovered them. So far from being a bastion of freedom for these poor people who were enslaved, the federal government was sending them right back to the South. So,
and if I could just say something on that too, real quick, is that people always bring up, well, if you're for secession, then you're for slavery or some sense, right? Well, that's just a non sequitur. Doesn't make any sense. But also, to my point, is a lot of the northern states used what's known as nullification, where states would nullify federal laws, and they used that specifically to combat the Fugitive Slave Act. So northern states would say, yeah, you're not allowed to send federal troops in here to collect the slave if he's run away. So we'll essentially grant him sanctuary within our state. And this is a form of secession without breaking away fully, but it's essentially saying, yeah, your laws have no power here. And that was used, to combat the federal overreach, essentially. So, there were actual examples of secession-like strategies that the North used to combat slavery instead of enshrining it, or that some states in the North did.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I remember one person, I can't remember his name. I'll have to see if I can find the quote, but he was accused, I think he was a congressman, and he was accused by some of his fellow congressmen of harboring escaped slaves and not sending them back as was required by the law. And he said, yes, I do. And this is my address. And anyone who's an escaped slave can come and I will help them. Just openly defying, because he knew what was right and he knew what was not right. Yeah. And in that case, the law was not right. So, and then we come then to the issue of, well, if the Civil War wasn't necessary to stop slavery, how was slavery ended? Or how could slavery have been ended? Because people make the mistake of thinking that, well, without the war to stop slavery, it never would have ended, and we still would have people enslaved today.
Yeah, that's just ahistorical, right? Like, if we think about it, like, America was the only, well, it wasn't technically America at that time, but the North and the South, that was the only war between like actual big countries that happened over slavery. Every other nation state in the world at that time ended slavery without a war. In fact, when people say, well, how could it have ended? People have to consider the slave trade was basically almost dead at that point. Like, it had been like 20, 30 years since England had already outlawed slavery. So that was a big trading port was England, which they would, be like an intermediary where they would, take slaves from Africa and ship them over to a bunch of different places, right? So they were no longer doing that at that time. So the ability and the cost it would take for the South to import new slaves would have been extremely expensive, considering that no one else was engaged in this at a time, right? So just like the cost alone would have been a reason you can say that it would have ended like naturally and peacefully. Now, of course, when you say that, that's not to say that, therefore it's okay that there were still slaves in the South, right? That's not what we're saying, obviously. But it is to say that the slave trade would have ended naturally. It would have come to a death on its own.
So then let me play devil's advocate for a minute and say, well, yes, well, the slave trade might have ended, but they still had slaves, and they would have just kept breeding more slaves and keeping these families to be their slaves. So what then would you say to that? How could that have been ended without a war?
Right. Well, what they could have done is they could have issued an order which said in the North that any slave who escapes into the North is automatically a citizen and is protected by our laws. Right. That would have been one way. And you could also have used either, some form of like local slave rebellion, or just essentially taking the slaves away in the middle of the night and, rescuing them essentially, right, from the actual plantations themselves. Right, that would have been perfectly morally justified to do, and they could have gone in these little like insurgent type things, and that would have been perfectly fine. Right. They also could have attempted to buy them and then free them. The North could have attempted to buy them from the plantation owners and free them. That's also another thing they could have done. And there were these like little slave rebellions that happened. Right. They're not really covered because obviously the war overshadows that, but they did happen. And there was like people who did rescue slaves and just, an underground railroad type situation where these people were smuggled out.
And I think definitely throwing the resources of the North instead of into killing people, into strengthening and really funding the Underground Railroad.
That's right.
Making it an above ground railroad.
That's right.
That would have been a much, much better. But not only did they not do that, like we mentioned, the Fugitive Slave Act, they did the opposite of that.
That's right.
So to say that it reminds me of how in the years leading up to the Second World War, when the Jews were trying to escape because they saw which way the wind was blowing in Germany, and America said, nope, you cannot come here.
Yeah, FDR turned back a boat full of Jews back to Germany.
And then they throw up their hands, look at this huge tragedy.
Right.
But you could have at least mitigated that before, and you did exactly the opposite of what would have helped.
Yeah, so it's kind of a red herring when they say this, right? That, well, how would slavery have ended if the North hadn't tried to end slavery? Well, the North didn't try to end slavery. That was like a thing that happened well into the war, where the narrative kind of changed, and they were like, well, you know what? Actually, we do need to do this, right? It was kind of a thing they had, like, long after the war was already waging and going on. They kind of decided that right after the fact. So yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, it's ironic. I think this was also something I was bringing up, which is that, Lincoln, who was considered this great emancipator, enslaved by conscripting 600,000 men into a meat grinder, right? That they didn't want to fight in. Yeah.
I remember Spooner said something very similar, that instead of the war ending slavery, the number of slaves have been greatly increased.
Yes.
Because now everyone in the South who had seceded was now subjected to a government that they did not want. And
that's right.
The only political justification for government power is the will of the people. But if you subject people to the government against their will, then that, what would you say, that moral authority that the government claims to have isn't even there, and you're just a conqueror and a tyrant.
Exactly, right. Because it's like these men were essentially in both the North and the South were conscripted against their will to go and fight and die, right? It's like, that has increased the number of slaves than what there was previously. And, a lot of times people will make it out to be that, the South, it's true. The Southern government, the Confederacy, did support slavery. But if you read like the notes between like just the average soldiers, like the poor, like downtrodden, like lower class, middle class, economically speaking, soldiers that were conscripted, they aren't talking about like, I'm fighting to defend slavery. No, they see it as this is just their home, and they're defending it from an invading force. You know what I mean? So it's like, it totally makes sense to me why, you can have some type of empathy or sympathy for like the Confederate soldiers, and so even so, the generals a lot of times, right? Like that makes complete sense to me. You don't have to support, the entire government just because you support, the Confederate soldiers defending their home, right? Because, and I mean, look, considering what happened, they had good reason. Sherman's march burned down all of the South practically. It was a bloodbath.
Yeah, and I think partly because of the way slavery was ended here, I think that indirectly or maybe directly has led to a lot of the racial tension that still exists.
Yes.
Because of the force that was used. It wasn't allowed to end peacefully and naturally like it did in other places, by people realizing, hey, this is wrong. This is something we shouldn't be doing, which would have happened eventually, either from moral pressure or from economic pressure. I mean, can you imagine nowadays someone wanting to buy a slave-produced cotton shirt?
Right. Yeah.
You'd be a pariah.
Exactly. Right.
But instead of doing that, it was by force. And then you've got the counter force of the KKK and etc. And then that made the government feel like they had to use counter force again to force people to integrate. Yeah. And it's just this cycle of coercion that is still going on.
Speaking of like the racial problems in America, it also does go like right after the war during Reconstruction, how they were treated by the government, right? Like the slaves. It's like that was like just terrible. Like anyone who like in my opinion, that's probably where it like most of it comes from. I mean, slavery, of course, right? But especially how they were treated afterwards from the government, like government Reconstruction. And Murray Rothbard had this great piece. I don't remember where he wrote it, but he was talking about like how when the North just destroyed all of the South through Sherman's march, they actually denied the slaves actual justice, because what happened is now the plantations that the slaves worked on and were the actual homesteaders of were now destroyed, and they were never like given to the slaves as like any type of compensation. You know what I mean? So it's like that they were also just freed, but they were essentially deprived of the fruit of their labor when they were freed. So that also, that also led to a lot of animosity, justly so, obviously, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. A double deprivation, because it was stolen from them and then it was destroyed.
That's
so they couldn't get it back. Oh.
Yep.
I particularly like the possibilities. It's easy to think about what could have been,
right?
But of course, there's the strong possibility that if they pursued those peaceful, or at least non-warfare means to end slavery, then the Confederacy would have stayed a separate nation, and then who knows what further secessions could have happened when they had disagreements among themselves, more secessions.
That's right.
And then would have set the precedent in the Union that if you, like what was said in the Declaration of Independence, if this political body does not represent you anymore, you have the right to alter it, to choose something else. But instead of that, you could have had maybe so many different, and maybe each state would have been its own state, not ordered around by a federal government, and maybe even more smaller states, instead of one giant leviathan controlling most of the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, when Lincoln went to war, it was more about establishing empire than it was freeing the slaves, right? So it's like, it is interesting to think about like what were the ramifications of the Union coming back together, right? Like, let's just say slavery would have ended, right? Let's just assume that, right? So we can get that out of the way. How much, in my opinion, better would things have been if, there had been more decentralization and more secession overall? I mean, it's, I can't say this with any evidence because it's all, what if, but perhaps World War I would not have happened. It would have happened, but not with the U.S. intervention, which also caused a lot of problems. If we had not had that fortified empire from, bringing the South back, just, this domino effect.
Yeah. And not only that, but that victory over the Confederacy that set up, like you said, that taste for empire. And then
Yeah.
that led to the Spanish-American War, where they
That's
took
right.
Cuba and the Philippines. And then that, of course, led to the First World War. And America's involvement in that helped to set up the Treaty of Versailles, which helped
Right.
set up the Second World War. And like we said earlier, that cycle of violence and coercion is
Yeah.
still continuing.
And some even communist dictators in the USSR even referenced Lincoln when there was talk of certain states trying to get out of the USSR. They're like, no, we gotta kind of be like Lincoln and shut that down. And it's kind of it's it set a terrible precedent, right? Like, because I look at like freeing the slaves as something separate from the actual war itself, right? Because obviously the North did not go in to free the slaves. So yeah, there is this horrible ramification. And also, anytime someone brings up secession nowadays, they either get accused of being a neo-Confederate, where they just want to bring back slavery, which is just on its face insane, right? That's just a non-starter. And also, they'll say that, well, we had a war to solve that issue. Well, war doesn't solve issues. Aggression doesn't solve issues. It just makes if me and you were having a disagreement and I beat you up or something, right? We wouldn't say that, well, we have solved our disagreement because I beat you up, right? That it doesn't make any sense. So it's just like when people say that, it's just like really like I don't know. I just find that kind of dumb.
Yeah, and I think a large part of that is just because that's the narrative that people are taught by the victorious government in their government schools.
Of course. Yeah.
And it feeds into that cycle where now that's deemed to be something that's okay. Which I was talking about my wife with this. It's kind of a betrayal of the original values that were laid out in the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
That was, we don't like to think of it, or Americans don't like to think of it that way, but it was a secessionist war.
Yes.
The colonists wanted to secede from the government over in England.
Right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And it's like I've had little like disagreements with conservatives about this on Twitter, when it's like, look, if you're conservative and you love the Constitution and the founding of America, you have to at least consider that America would not exist if it wasn't for a secessionist movement, right? That's what happened. Like the American colonists kicked out the British out of the colonies in America, right? Like that's just undisputed. Like, but they'll always say, well, that was an unjustified government, and then you're left, in this argument, well, what is a justified government, and all the way down. But I mean, looking at Lincoln was, just like even his domestic policies, he was a tyrant, right? He was like, he locked up journalists, he suspended habeas corpus, all these things, right?
Yeah, I remember reading a quote from him saying something about how, well, if I have to ignore the Constitution to save the Union, then that's what I'm going to do. That's right. Like, yeah. How much more tyrant? How much more clearly can you say I am a tyrant?
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So you can disagree, like the reasons people wanted to secede, and I do, right? Like if you're seceding from slavery, yeah, I don't support that. But also, if you're saying that, if the other person is saying that, well, we need to just, stop them from leaving, not because of slavery, but because for empire, then I also disagree with that, right? So you can hold both of these positions without them being like mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The issue isn't slavery, but can I subject you to my political authority?
That's right. Yes. And it goes against the Declaration, as you were saying.
And people conflate that with the issue of slavery, because obviously slavery is bad, violates fundamental rights.
Absolutely.
And they don't recognize that subjecting someone to a political authority they do not want also violates their fundamental rights. Yeah. Because it's easier to see that someone chained up is obviously having their rights violated.
That's right. Absolutely. It's like Spooner has that great quote, you're not free if the only thing you can do, I'm paraphrasing, but you're not free if the only thing you can do is choose between two new masters once every so often. It's like that, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And changing gears a little bit, but it's the same kind of argument that people make for government welfare. They're saying, well, this is a good thing, helping poor people. So we're justified in doing what it takes in order to get that to happen.
Yeah.
But we have to say the same thing. If this was a good idea, then you don't have to use force in order to accomplish it.
That's right. Yeah. If people find this valuable, if they find it a good thing, then they'll do it, right? For whatever reasons they want, they will do it. And I mean, if we look at like the history of mutual aid societies in America, and even before America, going all the way back, they were very prominent and very successful. And it's quite a tragedy that they've been essentially erased from American literature. Like any sign or trace of them in like history books is just gone, because obviously, that wouldn't support the state's narrative. The state wants you to believe that all these people were just dying in the streets before, the new society, LBJ's Great New Society.
Yeah, because of those greedy capitalists.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And it really, I think you phrased it perfectly. It's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that it's a tragedy not only exacerbated, but more or less caused by, again, the force and coercion of government intervention. Because once your part of your money is taken away from you to allegedly help other people, well, then first of all, you have less money, less means to help on your own. Second, there's the illusion that people are already getting the help they need.
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's okay.
I pay my taxes, so I don't need to donate to charity or help people. That's right.
But then that also becomes kind of, I would say, the competitor is, if you want to then run your own private charity, you have to try to compete with the government, which has limitless resources because it can keep stealing from people to do whatever it wants. And so then it's kind of a triple threat to people actually helping other people.
And I mean, it's just like a miracle that, people give as much as they do, even in spite of that, right? So you just have to imagine how much more they would give. Like, see, that's the thing, right? Is that the state has essentially disconnected local communities from each other. They've essentially alienated them to the point where it's like, well, there's this poor person on the street. It's like, a person walks by a poor person on the street and they think, wow, I wish we had a government program to, so this wouldn't happen, instead of actually helping the person. It's like, well, you could go make that person's life better just by going and saying hi, or just talking to them and maybe buying them a meal or something, but if your first thought is, well, we need a government program to stop that, it's like, that proves the alienation that they've caused. And communities used to be much more tight knit and like rely on each other and stuff like that, and then the state essentially destroyed that through coercive means, and it's a tragedy.
And it's destructive on a personal level too.
That's right.
Because if you feel bad for someone and you feel like you should help them, but you outsource that responsibility to someone else, then you're missing out on growth as a person, something that could make you better and help someone else at the same time.
That's right.
Both now missed out on something, and each of you is a little weaker because of that.
That's right. It destroys the morality of it, right? Because there's that quote that no free choice can be moral unless freely chosen. It's like, that's really the crux of it. It's like, having a government steal from your neighbor to pay for some homeless person on the street. Well, you may like the outcome of that. You created more wrongs on the way to get to that right than was necessary. You're right. You could have just helped that person yourself, right? So it definitely just kind of self-defeating in the sense that if you're looking at it through a moral lens.
Absolutely. Well, that's why we try to focus on not only running little charity campaigns and our ongoing campaigns to try to help people, but focus on spreading the message of why that's important to do voluntarily.
Yes.
And the foundation of liberty that is built on.
Right. Yeah. I'm a huge fan of you guys. I think you guys do great work.
Thank you. Yeah. I know you do your part trying to spread the message on Twitter. because
nothing compared to you guys, but I appreciate that. Thank you.
well, the more people hear it, I think, the more
Yeah.
Because lots of people have different ways of expressing things.
Mm-hmm.
There's the Murray Rothbards
Yeah.
and the Mises who can say things very eloquently.
Yes.
And there's people who just can tell it like it is and
right.
say it in a more approachable manner. And
For
you
sure.
never know if the way that you're saying it is what's going to resonate with someone and it's finally going to click for them.
Yeah, that's right. Right. Everyone approaches libertarianism through different ways and different paths. So it's definitely good to have like cast a wide net. Yeah. Wow. I definitely think that's the thing, right? Is that if we could just get back to a place where like more local communities actually like helped each other, I think most people would see the state's authority as just irrelevant, right? At least to the sense that like it's like if you can see like, yeah, we can take care of each other as a community. Yeah, why would we need the state to come in and act as a middleman? That's just unnecessary in the first place, right? So I think that should be the goal.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can get there. It seems like with the current situation, the COOF, as some people call it, more and more local authorities are starting to ignore what Big Brother government is telling them to do. DeSantis in Florida and others. So hopefully that's a trend that will continue.
Yeah.
And people realize, hey, we don't need someone in Washington telling us what to do all the time.
Right. It's also like really unfortunate how people straw man libertarianism because they'll say that, well, libertarianism is just everyone out for themselves, but there's nothing inherent in the philosophy that points there, right? All it says is that you own your own life. It doesn't say that it's wrong or you should just only care for yourself. It just means that you have the highest claim to your life, right? So yeah, the more people who can go out as libertarians and show that, oh yeah, look, we're going out and we're actually doing the work. We're actually helping these people on the ground. I think that's like the best way to do it. And I think like people get inspired by that. And when they see like one group doing it, people tend to want to say, oh, hey, I want to get in on that too. Right. So, yeah.
That was actually one reason why Logan Davies, our director, started Voluntarism in Action, because he was tired of people saying libertarians are just selfish. He's
right.
Like, I'll show you that.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah. So, but well, thanks very much for coming on. And
I was happy to. Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Your experience.
Yeah.
And your thoughts.
So, oh yeah, absolutely. This was a lot of fun.
It was. Maybe we'll be able to talk again sometime.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
Another Twitter battle.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for having me on, man.
Oh, thanks, Ace. Talk to you later.
Absolutely.